All right, my beautiful people. Let's talk about labor unions. This is the unit 3.2. Talk on labor unions. Workers. Let's talk about workers. What was going on in workers late 1800s? What were the working conditions like? Well, simple version is not very good. You have a situation where they're paid very, very little, less than $600 a year. Now, prices were cheaper at the time, but it's still not a lot of money. Their working conditions were pretty bad. They're working a 10-hour day, 6 days a week, 10 hours, 60-hour weeks, as opposed to a 40-hour week that we work typically today. So a third more than we already work now. In steel mills, it was worse because they're working 7 days a week, maybe not a particular person, but the mill stayed open, was working every day because they could not turn those furnaces off. Okay, so this thing has to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, holidays, doesn't matter, Christmas doesn't matter. Somebody's got to be there to keep at least the fires going in these furnaces. They did not want the furnaces going out, so they're working 12-hour shifts for $1.25 a day every day that they worked. Again, they didn't work 7 days a week, but still long shifts. Women, of course, were paid even less than men. Also keep that in mind. And children were being employed at the time. There was a lot of child labor in America, and we're going to start regulating that later, and you'll see how horrible this is. And there was no safety regulations. It was very dangerous work. We had one of the worst safety records of any country. We had the worst in the world. And I think I have this in here. 1890 railroad accidents injured one railroad worker out of every 30. And we're not talking about, I cut my hand, I got a little scratch, I got infected. We're talking stuff like broken bones, losing a hand or a limb, being pinched in between trains and things like this. It was very, very poor working conditions. It was typical of any of these dangerous working conditions. So keep that in mind when you say, oh, they're complaining and they're just complaining about money. Well, some of it was complaining about money, but a lot of it was about the working conditions that they had to work under. They were just pretty much horrific. All right, so let's talk about how they fought against these conditions. The main way is they unionized. And the idea behind a union is to try to re-equalize the relationship between workers and owners. In time periods past, you didn't really have this problem. They were already by nature pretty equal. You had a farmer who had a farm. He had a lot of crops that needed, to come in. So a guy would walk by and say, hey, this guy's corn's about in. I'd like to help him and earn some money. And so he goes up to the farmer and says, hey, I'd like to pick the corn. How much would you pay? That's not enough. I'll keep walking to the next farm. Maybe he'll pay me more. And this negotiation was pretty much on an even level. One had some money that the other needed, and the other had labor that the farmer needed. And so they're pretty much on an equal need and equal basis. Carnegie, when he had thousands of workers at his steel mill, did not care if one of them walked in and say, I've been burned a bunch of times. I'm not paid enough to do this job. Pay me more. Be like, well, if you don't want the job, somebody else will. So please leave. And that would have been his response, because one worker out of 40-something thousand just didn't matter. Now, if 40,000 workers walked into his office by doing it through a union and says, we are not going to work unless you do X, Y, or Z, now we've put the relationship back closer to an equal basis. Closer, it's still not equal. In labor unions, that's their role. The first of which we're going to talk about is the Knights of Labor. Right after the Civil War, you have the Knights of Labor that comes in, and they had the idea of unifying all workers all working men and women into a national union. So anybody, skilled, unskilled, race didn't matter, women, men, we'll take anybody, with a few exceptions, except lawyers, bankers, and saloon keepers. You had to produce something with your labor, and they didn't see those as someone who produced something with their labor. I find that funny. I'm weird that way. They tried to organize workers, and they did a pretty good job. From 1892, they were only 42,000. By 1896, they had the number had risen to 700,000 unionized workers. They were starting to have some modest success with small strikes in little areas, and all of that was pretty much destroyed with something called the Haymarket Square Riot, which they will be blamed for. And not only them, but pretty much all unionists were seen as this kind of, they all got tarred with the same feather. And I'll talk a minute about what happened at that riot, but that pretty much put a damper on the Knights of Labor. By the way, one of the questions on the test is going to be, what kinds of people are in these unions? That's what I'm asking. Are they skilled, unskilled? Women are not allowed. African Americans are not allowed. Who's allowed, who's not allowed into these unions? It's actually not as hard a question as you would think, but you're just going to go through the different unions and the kind of people that are allowed. Samuel Gompers and the AFL. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, is still around. It's combined with another union today, the CIO, but it's still around. And the idea of this union was not to take everybody. It was going to take skilled workers of the craft unions, steel workers, pipe makers, boiler makers. These would be skilled workers, not just general laborers. They didn't take women. They did not take racial minorities. So it's important to remember that, of who they don't allow in as well. It was led for 37 years by Samuel Gompers. Now, Samuel Gompers in that time becomes, even though he's not representing every worker, kind of a spokesman for every worker in America. He's seen through those, especially the later years, that he is the leader of the AFL, as the workers' voice on a national stage. So people are listening to this man as far as what the union or what the workers in general want. It does grow steadily until they have 1.7 million members. And like I said, it's still around today. It has combined with another union, but it's still around. What did they want? Bread and butter stuff, shorter hours, better working conditions, higher wages. Same thing unions are wanting today, generally speaking. Now, the shorter hours, we're talking about getting it down to a 10-hour or a 8-hour day, 40-hour a week kind of thing that starts to be talked about. It's not happening in a lot of places, but they start that conversation. The other one that's in the notes is the IWW, the International Workers of the World. Now, this is kind of the idea of an international labor union. Most of the time, you just have either labor unions that cover one particular area, like steel workers, or just the United States, skilled workers, like you see before. This one, we're going to take everybody from every country. Very communistic idea that you kind of see from Karl Marx's work. And that was kind of the mentality of this international work union. The IWW, also known as the Wobblies, was intended to be one big union, unite all the skilled and unskilled workers, so both were allowed. And again, looking at the bread and butter issues, better pay, shorter hours, better conditions. But they also believed that the workers and government should own the means of production. Very communistic idea. Kind of a radical socialist idea rather than democratic socialist idea, communistic idea. They never got very big. I think at their height, they got about 150,000 guys. They were always seen as kind of radical, kind of different, and they're going to die out by World War One. But they're what a lot of people associate, the kind of mentality that some people associate with unions is this one when it's not very typical. All right, the strikes. If you would, I want you to go through your notes, look at the strikes. You got the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. You got the Haymarket Square Riot of 1886 that you need to be aware of. Now, Haymarket, again, is going to cause a downfall of the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor are going to be accused of this, of being kind of anarchists, because what's going to happen is there's a strike going on. The police start marching toward these strikers, trying to break up some speakers that were speaking the next day after some violence that happened the day before. Somebody throws a bomb into the police, and I think 8 of them are killed. They then start shooting into the crowd and kill a bunch of people. Some people are blamed for it and executed for this crime, but the evidence against them, it's kind of circumstantial. Maybe they did it, I don't know. But regardless, it's seen as, it's one of those things that it really hurt the union movement because they're being blamed for this violence against policemen. Kind of see some of the echoes of these later in history. The Homestead Strike is also a very important one. This one is a strike that is very typical of steel workers. This one happens at Homestead in Pennsylvania. It's against one of Carnegie's mills, although he was not even in the country when this happens, and he left a little guy named Frick in charge to try to fight this strike that they knew was coming. And, well, they're going to break the strike, but it causes a lot of pro-union feelings because this was a very high-handed thing. The company comes in by hiring Pinkerton detectives, and not talking about 20, we're talking about thousands of Pinkertons that were armed. And the idea was to go into this plant, which was being occupied by the workers, and run them out, and then hire new workers. They would also throw them out of the company housing where these people were living. So they would be losing their job and their homes, and all because they wanted to strike. Well, it was the company's property. They were in their legal rights to take it back. So they sent in an army, literally, to retake this. And it ended in violence. The workers and the Pinkertons end up battling it out, and the workers are winning, at least in the violence. But the fact that there is violence gives the government, the governor specifically, the right to bring in the National Guard. 8,000 National Guard troops are brought in to end this violence, and we've kind of got this idea of big strikes, especially, only being broken up by the military in some form or fashion. The Pullman strike was very similar. This one starts as a local strike against the Pullman Company, who were paying their workers much less because of economic problems that were happening at the time. And this spread to all the other railroad workers around the country. Basically shut down railroads. Imagine a strike today that not only shut down railroad, air traffic, and the interstates, how detrimental that would be to the running of the country. And it scared people to death. Middle class people, rich people, politicians, it freaked them out that the unions had this much pull that they could shut down the railroads that were just so necessary for modern life, what they called modern life at the time. President Cleveland didn't have a lot of sympathy for the workers. He sent in the federal troops and ended the strike. He actually had the troops run the railroads to get this country up and running until new workers could be hired. And his excuse for doing so was that the strike was impeding U.S. mail. This is kind of the height of the government being on the side of big business. After that, you start seeing an element of more people getting should the government be involved in this, and what role should the government be? People start asking this question as we get into 1900s and the progressive era, and we've got some problems in society. What can the government do to help solve those problems? So we're going to be getting into some of that stuff coming up. Stay tuned. Stay up on your work. Please email me if you want to set up a meeting or talk to me about it or ask me any question. I'm pretty quick. I'll get it back to you in a day or two if you email me. Ask some questions. See y'all later. Be good. Bye.